Okay, I think we're about ready to get started. So I thank everyone so much for joining in for today's session. If you haven't had a chance, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. But on behalf of the Pennsylvania Care Partnership, we're so excited to have everyone joining us today. My name is Kelsey Leonard. I'm the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership. And today's session is entitled Embracing Diversity, Celebrating National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, or BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in terms of that term and that terminology if you haven't heard of it before. Again, this is a photo for me, but also my contact information. So if anyone doesn't have my contact information or needs it, I'll also enter it into the chat box, but it's leonardkt@upmc.edu. I'm putting that into the chat box now so folks can have that if you need to copy it readily. But if you have any questions about today's session or anything else that I can help you with, technical assistance wise, any types of information that I can provide to you, please let me know and don't be afraid to reach out via email. So many of you probably joined today in anticipation of our session with the Black Urban Gardeners and Farmers of Pittsburgh Cooperative. That was with our keynote speaker, Rakib Bey, who unfortunately sends her regrets that she cannot be here to join us for today's session. There was a death in her immediate family, and as such, we are looking to reschedule that session at a point in time that allows for her family's healing and mourning during this difficult time. So we send her, as well as her family, our condolences. And for those that were looking to attend this session, again, she sends her regrets, and she is looking forward to hopefully rescheduling the session at a future date and time. That being said, we really felt that it was important to keep the momentum going that we've been building around cultural and linguistic competency through this series in celebration of National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I will be offering a session for the remainder of the hour that we have together that really looks at what we've been doing through systems of care around CLC and some of the current and emerging resources that have been brought to our attention because of the existing racial and social injustices in our society, and that many of our communities across Pennsylvania have been facing in recent months, but also for quite some time in terms of the history of racial and social injustice in America. So with that, you're welcome to stay on. We hope we can keep this core mass of folks who has signed on to attend today's session here. But if for some reason you would like to sign off, you can do so as well. But we're happy to continue on with offering you some great content. So it's been rescheduled, and we will notify you through our Pennsylvania Care Partnership newsletter of the new date that it will be rescheduled for. So I just wanted to provide some background and some insight into these webinar sessions and why we find that they're really important to host, particularly in the month of July. And as I've mentioned before, this is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. It was created in 2008 through legislation that was pushed forward by Bebe Moore Campbell, and she really was just a wonderful human being in raising awareness of the mental health disparities that face minority communities and communities of color. And up until and really 2008, that was only 12 years ago. So we're really thinking about within our mental and behavioral health care systems, we weren't raising the really challenging issues of disparities and differential treatment of minority communities at a national scale. And so July is this month, and this awareness month is really an opportunity for us to take some time to reflect, to look at what we're doing locally, to look at what we're doing within our organizations, within our counties, within our agencies, and say, could we be doing more? Where are our gaps? Where are we, maybe missing the mark in a lot of ways? And I think in doing that self-reflection and that organizational reflection and assessment, we also are challenged to say, who are the voices that we're missing from these conversations? Who are the communities that are facing disparate impacts and disparate levels of delivery of care? And where are they in these conversations? Are they involved in the decision-making processes? Have they been solicited for feedback in terms of the policies that we are creating and the way in which those policies are being implemented at the local level? So, you know, when they set out to create this National Awareness Month, they really wanted us to understand that mental health conditions do not discriminate based on race, color, gender, or identity. And yet, in the way in which care is being able to be accessed, there are high levels of discrimination and high levels of disparities. Folks who, because of their race, gender, color, identity, don't have the same level of access as those who represent the majority of our society. And so we really have been working to bring you a set of learning and sharing opportunities over the course of this month that challenge us to have those moments of self-reflection, to think deeper, to think courageously, and to reach out to our neighbors and to our colleagues and to our peers to try and make a better system of care and systems of care across all of Pennsylvania and all the work that we do collectively, because we're stronger together. Now, that said, there's also been a movement in the work of cultural and linguistic competency. There's multiple movements consistently happening around terminology. Even the term cultural and linguistic competency, as I'll note to you later, is evolving, and there are new terms that are emerging in those standards and principles. And we see the same sort of mirrored movements of change happening in the context of Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, particularly for 2020. So for this year, we've seen a lot of conversation about stepping back from the term minority and saying BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And we'll do a better, I'll also go into more detail, but you may have seen a few social media campaigns or other references, maybe even your own organization or county, particularly reference the month as BIPOC Mental Health Month. And that's still July, but it's an evolution of this National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. Now, unfortunately, this is more of a culture change right now. It might change later on more formally, but formally in the legislation, the month is known as National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. So just something for you to be aware of in this work. I also wanted to highlight that Mental Health America has, they've really spearheaded a lot of the campaigning around BIPOC Mental Health Month and that language, and they've got some really great resources on their website if you're thinking about in the remainder of what we have for July, or even continuing past July, if you want to get some inspiration for an event or a training or a topic that you could offer. I really encourage you to go to their website and check out some of the resources that they have. So BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So it's really a term that brings together a lot of the diversity that we have across America, but also draws attention and focus to the uniqueness of distinct communities. Now, that being said, there is also a little bit of resistance or challenge. Some people don't like the BIPOC term because they feel like it can homogenize communities of color, minority communities, into kind of one term. But in the same way that minority did that too. So we're seeing that in place of using the term minority, people are now using BIPOC, and maybe in a year or 2 years from now, as our societies evolve, we'll be using a different term as well. So terminology is really complex. You also may have heard of people of color before, and now BIPOC is also kind of an added evolution of that term, because POC wasn't being, again, it was sort of very homogenizing. It wasn't really identifying distinct cultures or distinct aspects of disenfranchisement within America. So that Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are connected in the experiences and really are the foundation to the experiences of other peoples of color and the systemic instances of racism and social injustice that we see now in America, given the history of America and its first peoples, and then the extension of the horrific aspects of slavery and the legacy of slavery within this country. So some of the other terms you might hear: African American, yes. Black, also, yes. Those are still really popularly used terms. Also referencing too that both in the AP, sorry, the Associated Press Style Guide, it is now required to capitalize the B in Black, which I think you're probably asking yourself, why is she talking about capitalization? Why does that even matter in the work that we do? Well, it matters a lot when we think about intake forms, when we think about policy writings that we're developing, even outreach and communication. Something as simple as not capitalizing a community's identifier can really disenfranchise them, can make them feel offended. And it's a microaggression, which we'll also talk about later, that exacerbates the existing experiences of racial trauma and systemic injustice in our societies. So it might seem small to you in terms of capitalization, but it's actually a really big affirmation, a small step of affirmation that can go a long way in the work that we do. So the last term that's up there is BAME, and that also stands for Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic Groups. That's sometimes how it's used. There's a few other different other words that can be placed in for those letters within the acronym, but that's sort of really touching into the Black Asian experience. So you're probably asking, okay, she just gave like so many terms. Some of these I have never heard before. So when in doubt, be specific. So what that means is look at the communities that are present in your like region, in your geographic scope, in your county or in the state, even if we're thinking at the national level, you know, and also the folks that you're working with, the youth and families that you're directly working with. Ask them, what community do you come from? You know, how do you identify? What are great terms that I should use? Do you like Black? Do you like African American? Do you use BIPOC? Maybe they have a different term. And I think it's good in the work that we do to have a bit of cultural humility throughout the process, to say, it's okay to say, I don't know, but I want to make sure that I'm using the right terms that are appropriate and that you identify with. So with that, I wanted to highlight again that the BIPOC Mental Health Month, that the materials and everything that the Mental Health America has put forward, there's a toolkit, and so that's available, and I'm going to post it now into the chat box along with our slides for today so that everybody has access to those. We also will be posting the recording and the slides on our Pennsylvania System of Care Partnership website. We have a CLC page there where all of our past trainings and webinars are available, especially if you haven't been able to participate on past sessions. So that I just posted the toolkit into the chat box, and the slides are now loaded there as well. So definitely encourage you to download those. So back to what I was saying, I wanted to provide a little bit of objectives for today. That was kind of a primer of what we're going to do today, and just kind of making sure that everyone feels oriented and on the same page. So a little bit of today, we're going to talk about some of the basic CLC principles of the work that we do. We're going to discuss some of the mental health disparities, particularly facing BIPOC communities, so Black, Indigenous, people of color. And then we're also going to learn about some anti-racism practices and discuss some initiatives for improving care, improving the way in which we provide access to care and provide programs and policies that can enhance that access. So I thought we'd start with an activity that I love to do in our trainings and additional trainings where we are in person for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership, is this question of what is culture? And I feel like we'll just take a moment that if you want to respond in the chat box to what your thoughts about what is culture, how do you define it? What are key aspects or principles, factoids that you look to say, oh yeah, that's what I would say defines a person's culture. We've got some people starting to write in. Culture is the foods you eat, the ways in which people interact in your group, the ways you celebrate your history, food, dress, music, ways of celebrating, ways of expression. your heritage, your connection to family, a collection of beliefs or practices, a people's customs, yeah, these are great responses. They really, a different section of the city where they lived at. Yeah, it could be your neighborhood, your neighborhood, your town that really informs your culture. Yeah, those are great responses. And please feel free to keep adding them in there as maybe it sparks something. I find that in all of these sessions, we also kind of come out with a new sort of crowdsourced collective definition of culture. But it's definitely, I think another way of thinking about culture is also thinking about the cultural groups that you currently identify with. So we're going to do a little bit of an activity, and if you have a piece of paper nearby, that would be great. We're just going to jot some things down. If you don't have a piece of paper, you might be able to write it on your phone or like pull up a little note or Word document on your computer. But I'd love to know, what are your cultural groups? And when we say cultural groups, we're thinking of groups of people who consciously or unconsciously share identifiable values, norms, symbols, and some ways of living that are repeated and transmitted from one generation to another. And that's a big part of too of how we see the definition of culture, because it's attached to the groups that we belong to. So in doing this activity, it's called the 5 circles activity. And again, the slides are posted into the chat box. I will post them one more time right now while we're all getting situated. So later on, if you want to do this activity more hands-on, you can print out this slide number 11. And what we ask is that you write in each circle a different cultural group that you identify with. So that could be, I am Asian American, I am a mom, I play basketball, different things. Like, what are the 5 top things that you feel really identify you? And you're welcome also to actually type these into the chat box if you feel bold enough. And even if you just want to type one thing, that will really help us to get to the next stage of today's session. Thanks so much. You've got some folks that are typing into the chat box. Older worker, church member, natural hair, love that one. So yeah, this could be religious affiliations. It could be, it's just the things that, like, when you think about if someone was going to write a biography about you, like, these would be the top 5 things or chapters that maybe of your book. So we've got more folks writing in. Someone said woman, someone said Indian, Catholic, VR counselor, old skater, love that. I'm a mom, Latina, love different foods from all ethnicities. Mom, speed skater, Southern California native, vegan, mental health advocate, love that. Advocate, European ancestry, Christian, farming, country, mom, grandmother, wife, mother, social worker, Indian. Yeah, fantastic. So, and for those that, if you want to keep adding to the chat box, please do. What I love about this activity, and for those that contributed into the chat box, you can really start to see a lot of overlaps with other folks, ways in which there are similarities. And then you also can see ways in which you have differences as well. What I really also love about this activity, in identifying kind of your 5 main cultural groups, you also are narrowing in on your perspectives of privilege, or the perspectives that you privilege in your everyday life, because they're just a part of you. It's unconscious in a way. And sometimes that's called unconscious bias. A lot of people have a negative connotation with unconscious bias because in a lot of ways it can lead to very negative actions. But sometimes our unconscious bias, our implicit bias, is also just the way in which we privilege certain perspectives because they're who we are. They're a part of our identity and how we came to connect with other people and groups in the world. The part where we want to have people focus on, though, is that you need to know who those cultural groupings are that you identify with, who are the privileged perspectives that you center in your worldview, Because once you know that, then you know the other areas where you need to branch out to learn more, to be able to understand where the communities that you work with, where the youth and families that you work with may be coming from, because there's no overlap. You don't really understand their worldviews or their perspectives because they're not centered in your lived experience. And so that's why I think this is a really great activity, especially for staff, for frontline workers, for hi-fi teams, for evidence-based practice teams, to really say, okay, what are the worldviews that I'm privileging in my everyday life, and how might that be extending into my work life? And could it be causing any types of unknown harm to youth or families because I just don't really understand where they're coming from, because I didn't realize that I was implicitly, unconsciously privileging my own worldviews and perspectives in my day-to-day. So with that, I think that's a big part of why it's important to understand our cultures, to understand other people's cultures. And it's really the set of attitudes, values, beliefs, symbols, and behaviors shared by a group of people, but different for each individual, and usually communicated from one generation to the next. And why I think that is so important is because of the intergenerational aspects of our work and of the way in which we understand healing, as well as the way in which we understand illness in our communities, that there is this intergenerational component. And particularly for a lot of the work that we're doing now around trauma-informed care and the way in which trauma impacts mental health for youth and families, we really have to understand that intergenerational component and the legacy of historic traumas and the way in which that can continue to impact our communities. So another way that I really love to introduce this topic to folks is, and some folks may have seen this with the trauma-informed care trainings, there's usually a trauma iceberg. Well, I call this the cultural iceberg, and it's really trying to hit home for folks that there are a lot of things that we perceive above the surface, right, at the tip of the iceberg about an individual or a person or youth that we may be working with. Sometimes that's language or dialect or accent. Sometimes it's their actions. Sometimes it's their gender, maybe the way in which their behaviors manifest, their race. These are things that we think, sometimes we get it wrong, but they're generally ways in which we think we understand a person's culture right off the bat. Neurologically, we're processing that in the first 30 seconds to a minute of meeting someone. However, in the work that we do through cultural and linguistic competency, through systems of care, we really want to challenge all of our staff, our administrators, our county systems to think beneath the surface, below the water line, and really say, what are the things that we're not capturing in that initial intake or introduction with a family and with a youth who is seeking services. And sometimes that could be things related to age, things related to style, values, different physical abilities. We also are not aware of folks' lived experiences. These are things that take time to get to know about a person, including potentially also their religion, their sexual orientation, and other aspects, even further down on the bottom of the iceberg, that embrace their culture. Because if you go back to the cultural group activity that we just completed, when you think about some of those items, they're probably not necessarily things that come out innately in the 5 minutes of meeting a new person. They're probably things that folks learn about you over the course of some time of knowing you and building a friendship and building trust with you. And so I think that's, that's a really big takeaway for understanding the cultural iceberg, is to say, how am I building trust with folks so that I can get to know what sits beneath the surface? And how are we creating systems of care that allow for us to build that trust and continue to build trusting and respectful relationships with our communities? So for folks that are coming into this work and maybe weren't familiar with cultural and linguistic competency prior to National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, we want to just orient you with some definitions. And what that is to say is that there is individual competency, right? There's the individual work that we can do as human beings, as staff members, as administrators, to enhance our ability to effectively communicate and work in the context of cultural differences. But then there's also ways in which we can advocate and work for systems change, for there to be cultural competency at the organizational level, which is really for there to be a set of policies and programs in place that make it so that a system agency and the professionals that are underneath that umbrella of the organization are empowered to work efficiently and effectively in cross-cultural situations. But for both of those things to occur, individual competency and organizational cultural competency, we really also have to be conscious of creating spaces for culturally competent mental health care, recognizing that there have been historical experiences of prejudice and discrimination, racism, as well as discrimination against certain cultural beliefs as it pertains to health or illness, and certain privileging of certain ideas of health and illness within our larger systems and healthcare system and mental health care system that disenfranchises certain communities and certain groups. And so it's important for us to recognize that to change both at the individual level and the organizational level, we have to reconcile with the legacies that have maybe created imbalances and experiences of distrust and disrespectful experiences for many individuals and communities. Now, oftentimes when we're doing this work, we focus a lot on the cultural aspects, and we forget that in CLC, there's an L, and it stands for linguistic competence. And I really love this definition that was done by Good and Jones in 2006, and you can read their fuller article and some of the work that they've developed. But they said in their work that linguistic competence is the capacity of an organization and its personnel to communicate effectively and convey information in a manner that is easily understood by diverse audiences, including persons of limited English proficiency, those who have low literacy skills or are not literate, and individuals with disabilities. Now, there are two aspects of that I really want to focus in on. I think we generally associate linguistic competency with making sure that we are meeting the needs of youth and families with limited English proficiency. But we often forget about the youth and families that may have low literacy skills, that may have different ability levels, and are really in need of making sure that they have access to care given their hearing or vision impairment. And so making sure that we are really building out equitable systems that are prepared to not only know the needs of the communities that they're serving, but then adapt and build out program responses to those needs. And we've heard from quite a few folks over the last year in the cultural and linguistic learning opportunities that we've created that literacy is a really big aspect of our work and should be something that we consider a lot more, particularly because we have a lot of terminology in mental and behavioral health care that doesn't translate to a lay audience, to everyday folks who are going through really difficult times. So it's important when we think about how we're creating information, how we're doing outreach and engagement with folks, that we are being considerate of varied literacy levels in conjunction with limited English proficiency levels of folks that are seeking services. So you're probably in the work that you're doing, you're going to face some cultural bumps along the way, is what I like to call it. And when I mentioned earlier that we all need to operate within a spectrum of cultural humility, I think it's really important when you're going to have these cultural bumps. You know, there are a wide variety of understandings of mental health and healing and what constitutes wellness, also what constitutes illness, and trying to explain the causes, symptoms, treatment, the way in which a family is also going to receive that information is going to manifest with some cultural bumps along the way, especially if you're not familiar with the culture of the youth or family that you're working with. And I would say that the biggest advice in navigating those cultural bumps is to have that cultural humility and to ask. When you don't know, ask and be as specific as possible. And to also be aware of body language. When you're speaking with folks and they just don't seem to really be understanding or receptive to the terminology that you're using or to the explanations that you're giving, it's important for us to have those check-in moments to have some self-reflection and to be aware of folks' body language to maybe pivot and have to present materials in different ways. So this introductory section of today's presentation is really to center our conversation on the fact that culture matters. When we're doing this work and when we're trying to also understand the current climate of our world and the racial and social injustices that our communities are facing, it's with the caveat that to be able to address these injustices, we have to first create a new system of valuation where we are saying that culture matters. And it matters because when culture is ignored, families are at risk of not getting the support they need, or worse yet, receiving assistance that is more harmful than helpful. So with that, I wanted to take a moment to pause, and I want to show you a video. Okay, we're going to play, this is a PSA that was made for Black Lives Matter, and it's particularly a PSA for the deaf. So I'd love to just ask now if anyone has reflections or thoughts related to what you just saw, and if you want to type them into the chat box. Got a few folks commenting now. We see how we have to give the opportunity to different groups to express themselves. They spoke with such passion. To be heard. There are many different ways to use your voice, yes. The deaf are perceptive, they hear loud and clear. Yeah, these are wonderful responses, and I felt that video was really powerful as we transition into a conversation about practices around anti-racism, particularly as we also think about accessibility in our work and in the policies that we develop. I think that we have these instances of discrimination within our society where even in spaces of trying to uplift communities, we can unknowingly or knowingly disenfranchise large swaths of our community. And so I think this is really important for folks to see that the deaf community, you know, there are also, you know, deaf Black people who also are in support of Black Lives Matter. There are deaf allies who are non-BIPOC folks that wanted to say, you know, we support this and our voices matter. And so I felt that was really powerful to think too about the ways in which we can re-envision our programming, our policies, and engagement and outreach to really think through how we can be engaging more diverse voices in the work that we do. And I think it also speaks to how sometimes we learn racism and prejudice and bias, that these are things that are not innately human qualities. They're constructs of society. Race in and of itself is a construct of the human society. So it's something that if we build it, we can also take it away. But it means that we have to have a concerted effort to change and to unlearn a lot of what has been constructed and built into our current society and world. And so, you know, really what scientists have seen is that these aspects of learned prejudice start as early as the age of 3. So we're really starting to see toddlers pick up ideas of racial prejudice, of discrimination, of stereotypes. And So I think that's really important too in the work that we're doing with children and with youth and families to really see whether or not we are further contributing and exacerbating those learned instances of racial prejudice, and if we are trying to do what we can to reconcile it and remedy that and change our behavior so that we're not enforcing racial prejudice in the work that we're doing, but also finding ways that we can encourage families to learn and grow alongside us. So when we think about how our biases reinforce, again, these are things that are being learned, and these stereotypes and prejudices often persist because we don't allow for contrary points of view. We don't allow for evidence that contradicts these stereotypes or these prejudices that keep getting put forward as fact, but in reality, they're these sort of mythical legends that are put forward over long periods of time. And so now I think what you're seeing in terms of a lot of the climates and communities is to challenge the narrative, to say, no, that isn't fact, that is a myth, that is a stereotype, that is a prejudice that's being put out by folks from one community about another community that they don't even belong to. And so I think that's a big part of also how we can try to reimagine our work, is to think through how we can combat some of the existing stereotypes and prejudices. And I have some videos later on of folks that give some really great suggestions and some resources too that we'll be sure to provide to you. So there's also different types of bias. So there can be hidden bias. Hidden bias is sometimes what is called the mental residue in most of us, that we aren't actively trying to be racist or trying to enact prejudice or stereotypes, but sometimes we've been conditioned, we've been socialized through our families, through our communities, to think of certain ways and to have certain prejudices. And now it's up to us to be conscious of that mental residue and try and unlearn those prejudices and those stereotypes. And it's a long journey, and that's why we say a lot of the work that we do through CLC, it's not a checklist where once a year you can say, oh, I did a CLC training, or I offered that to my staff, they're good to go for the next 5 years, or they're totally competent and they can work with in cross-cultural situations more effectively than they ever have before. It doesn't work like that. It's not a checklist. It's something that as individuals, we have to constantly be enhancing our understanding of worldviews outside of our own. And then also as organizations, we have to consistently be building that in to our systems and to our administration and the way in which we operate. So you also can have racism without racist. I think a lot of times when people hear the word racism, they're like, but I'm not a racist. And that is probably very true. You probably are not a racist. And I don't think anyone is calling you a racist when we say that there is systemic racism in our systems. And so that's a really big point. You can have implicit bias. You can have racial trauma that is passed on to individuals and communities because of racism without necessarily being the direct target of a racist individual. It can be very systemic. And so at the bottom here, you'll see on this slide, it says implicit racial bias has given rise to a phenomenon known as racism without racist, which is really the understanding that institutions or individuals act on racial prejudices, even in spite of good intentions and non-discriminatory policies or standards. So it's, again, this unconscious actions that we often have where we privilege our own lived experiences and worldviews to the detriment of others. And it's not necessarily saying that you have ill intent or that you're doing it maliciously. It's understanding that you're probably doing it through this aspect of mental residue and unconsciousness, but it still means that there's a racism impact on communities who are being impacted negatively and detrimentally. So everyone has implicit bias. I think that's another big takeaway for today. We all have a certain preference for our groups, and you saw that in the activity that we did. It's not necessarily a bad thing. What's bad is if we aren't recognizing that implicit bias and the way that it is potentially negatively impacting another individual or community. So some of the consequences, I wanted to orient this particularly to mental health and behavioral health in some of our providers. So when a provider has a pro-white implicit bias, interactions with non-white youth and families are often characterized by, and this was a study that was done by Roeder and Steiner in 2013 and 2012. They found that these were the ways in which this implicit bias can manifest, so that you have racism without racists. So in the sense that the providers, we don't think that the providers were racist, they were just acting on these implicit prejudices that created a culture of racism within the delivery of care. And so ways in which they saw this manifest were higher verbal dominance, slower speech, and less positive affect when compared with interactions with white youth and families. So providers were literally changing the way in which they spoke to youth and families of color or non-white youth and families. They also saw that there was less involvement of BIPOC youth and families in decision making, and they were less centered in the interactions with providers. Now, this then translated into the BIPOC youth and families having less satisfactions with their visits. They often would not adhere to the plans that were created for them, and there was a lower trust and confidence in the provider. So overall, by not recognizing the implicit biases that we all carry with us, we're contributing directly to the harm of a youth and families, or the ineffective delivery of care, because we aren't building trusting and respectful relationships. So I wanted to just kind of show you more practically how this manifests in the schools and in the work that we're doing potentially with schools. This is a short video that was put out by TED Talks Live, and it shows a little bit about unconscious bias and the way that it actually has this long-lasting systemic impact of racial trauma on an individual, and particularly on a BIPOC youth. So I'm just going to press play here.
Hi, Mom, it's me. I got in trouble again at school today.
Hi, this is Miss Jones again. I'm finding your son very disruptive in class, more so than other students.
I feel like the teacher doesn't like me. Other kids do bad things, but they don't get in trouble.
He's defiant and shows a real lack of respect for any structure or authority.
I hate school because the teachers are always mean to me and I don't feel like I'm learning anything.
I'm really concerned about his behavior.
I'm always getting in trouble for what I didn't do.
We're going to have to adopt a zero-tolerance policy, young man.
School keeps calling my mother, and she gets really, really mad at me.
What is going on? You'd better explain.
I feel like the whole world is just turned up against me and doesn't like me anymore. There are days I get up and I just decide I'm not going to school.
And we go to the park, like everybody's always telling me I'm not worth anything, so what's the point of trying?
I know the cops are watching us, but we just hope we don't get caught.
Your son's absences are a problem. They will definitely affect his grade point average.
I don't feel safe in my class anymore.
Should I assume you're unprepared again today?
I would always eventually get picked on by the teacher. He makes examples of me.
I feel really singled out, and I just try to avoid people because every time I look, somebody's always talking about me. Oh, she's always getting in trouble.
But I started fighting more because nobody wants to hang out around a troublemaker. The only time I have real friends is when I'm on the block. So that's where I'll stay.
I'm sure you understand we take our discipline policies very seriously here at the school. What are we going to do about your son?
having seen that, listened to that, there might have been a little delay on the feedback for some folks with the play of the video, but what unconscious biases did you identify in the short film? You can feel free to type that into the chat box. Just give people a few moments to locate their chat boxes. And negative assumptions of one's ability, adult assumption of failure, different expectations teachers had with different students. Yeah, I think it really speaks as well to some of the systemic racism issues that we see in our schools and across our systems when we really start to think about the way in which certain communities are targeted or are seen as inherently violent or inherently having some type of behavior problem, when in reality that's not the case. You know, there are behavior issues that occur across the board despite one's race, gender, color, or or other creed, but yet we are seeing disparities in the treatment of African American and Latino youth, as the video showed. And yeah, I think someone mentioned just now, it really shows also the way in which racial trauma, that vicarious trauma, can impact a young person's mental health. It's sort of these seeds of depression, as someone said, starting in that young person, because they are within what's sort of called this labeling theory. They're labeled as less than, they're labeled as, bound for sort of what has been now deemed the school to prison pipeline, and they're put into this vicious cycle that shouldn't be occurring. And it's often, again, a part of that mental residue of implicit bias and systemic racism in the system that is, disproportionately harming certain aspects of our community and certain parts of our community. We're going to hear from another young lady, another video later on that also speaks to this, and I think it really is an impetus for why so many young activists are speaking out right now about the way in which the Black Lives Matters movement is also about a movement for mental health and a movement for justice. Just going to go next to the reason also why this is really important in understanding for our work is microaggressions, both for the way in which microaggressions impact our staff, but also the way that they impact youth and families that we're serving. So a microaggression can be a question, a comment, even an intended compliment, but that sometimes nevertheless suggests something demeaning. And so you're welcome to type into the chat box now examples of microaggressions that you've experienced, but they usually, some of the ones that we have noted here, someone telling a person of color that he or she or they is so articulate, which implies that all of other people of color are not, something like that. We've also had instances where, and another example was, you're not like those other women, gays, lesbians, blacks, Latinos that I've met. So what does that mean? Does that mean all other women that you've met are somehow less than because you're sort of putting me into this finer light or pedestal? So, or that somehow, that the person that you're speaking to is the exception rather than the rule. And so these are examples of microaggressions that can occur, and folks might have their own personal examples. If you'd like to share in the chat box, you can. I wanted to just move a little bit forward, but I'll show you, this will be included in your PowerPoints that you can download. This is called StoryCorps. They do these wonderful social justice community pieces that really talk to some of the social injustices that your communities may be facing, your youth and families may be facing. This one is called Facundo the Great, and it's about a child whose name was Facundo, and they wanted to change his name because none of the teachers could pronounce it. So they said, well, why don't you say Fred, and why don't you say this? And they were always shortening the kids' names to something that was more anglicized, more English leaning. And what they realized is if you tried to, shorten Facundo, it actually wound up sounding like a curse word. So it's this really lovely learning story and cartoon video that I think can really translate for a lot of folks in terms of why it's important to value other cultures and why other cultures matter. And it's also a learning tool for understanding how you can also use multimedia use cartoons, use different media sources to engage your communities that you're working with. So I want to transition now to two videos in the time remaining and then open it up for some questions. It's been kind of an open exploratory session today. But this particular video comes from Imadi, and she is the founder of Depressed While Black, and I've got their information in the next slide. They are a fantastic grassroots organization that is providing a lot of resources for young Black people who are dealing with issues around mental health and behavioral health, and she can talk about it way better than I can. So I'm gonna just play that for everyone now.
Hey, this is Imade. I am the founder of Depressed While Black. It's an online community that shares mental health stories and resources from an African American lens. And it's also a charitable initiative that donates Black affirming personal care items to mental hospital patients. With everything that's going on right now, racial violence has definitely had a huge effect on my wellness, for sure. I experienced sleep issues, insomnia, stress, anxiety, just body tension. I just experienced a lot of fear because, you know, Breonna Taylor looks like me. So many of these Black folks that got killed, they look like me. They sleep, you know, they drive their cars. They do things that I do every single day, and they were killed during these things. So I would just say for young folks right now who are also affected by it, make sure that you surround yourself with mental health tools and resources and support to process what you're feeling, and also to help channel it so that you can get involved and be a part of the movement. And I know for me, you know, what really helps is finding healing spaces to process the immense amount of grief and mourning that I experience, and to also find ways in which I can get involved and act. And so one of the things that helped me is, you know, just sharing my stories about mental health issues and experiences. We know that folks who have untreated mental illness are 16 times as likely to be killed by the police. We know that folks that are mentally ill are criminalized for no reason. Even for myself, when I told my therapist that, you know, I'm dealing with suicidal thoughts, I took a nap, I woke up to two police officers doing a wellness check, and I wasn't sure if I would come out of that situation alive. So all that you're feeling right now, all these experiences, they're so valid. You know, you should feel angry about this. You should feel upset. You should feel mourning and sadness. Everything that you're experiencing is so valid, because we are people who want our Black people to live and to thrive. And when we don't see that, and when we feel like that's a reflection of what may happen to us, it is terrifying. So I would say just get all the mental health support that you need and join the movement. You can donate to organizations like BEAM that provide healing spaces for Black folks. You can look up different actions that are in your area with M4BL. They're called M4BL, Movement for Black Lives. They have plenty of actions that you can get involved. I highly encourage also just listening to podcasts and to which is wellness, wellness apps as well. Liberate is a meditation app for people of color and Black folks. Ethos Club is an amazing wellness virtual space that is also a real space, but they've gone virtual. And also therapy for Black girls as well. And you can also do Blackline. Blackline is a hotline for Black folks to process racial trauma. And it's a text and also a call service. So there's so many ways to not just get involved, but to also heal yourself. That's so important, because our rest and our wellness is our resistance. That's something that the NAP ministry shared. And so I would just say, you should feel how you should feel. Get the support that you need so that you can resist.
Wonderful. So I hope that came through okay. And if you had any audio issues, I've included the links in the slides, so you'll be able to watch that on your own. But yeah, so Amadi, she runs an organization called Depressed While Black. And so you can go to depressedwhileblack.com. They have a lot more resources. You can learn more about what their organization is doing. It's just really fantastic work and some great resources out there right now. And then this is the last video I wanted to share with you today before I provide you some resources. And we just have a general Q&A to see how, as a Pennsylvania Care Partnership, we can be supporting your work more. But I really thought it was important to leave you with the voices of our youth, and particularly one youth, Sophia. So we're going to listen to Sophia now. And as we're watching these videos, if you have any thoughts or questions and you want to start typing them into the chat box, please feel free to do so. I'm moderating that as we watch these. So thanks so much.
Hello, my name is Sophia Guerra, and I'm from the Bay Area. I'm a mentor at Bring Change to Mind, and I also have pretty wild dreams of redefining U.S. national security and bringing a logic for security that hinges upon international solidarity and justice. So at first glance, my two passions right now are not remotely related, but they both have to do with finding a home, and that's what a lot of my work centers on. And that can mean finding home when you're stateless, or when you don't have a roof over your head, or finding a home in your own head, your own body, or your own country. For example, I'm Salvadoran and Mexican American, so based on my race and people's assumption about my family's countries of origin, I am often rejected by American society. But the thing is, I've also never been to Mexico or El Salvador, and I will never be fully Mexican or fully Salvadoran, and I am thus rejected by those countries as well. So where does that leave me? Where does that leave my family when we're rejected, even villainized by ICE, by police, and even neighbors? This is a feeling a lot of people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people, are familiar with. That feeling of where do I belong? How can I feel safe in my own body when it's criticized and politicized and villainized because of the way I look? This is why racism, even aside from the actual physical atrocities that emerge from it, is so violent. It has a serious effect on your mental health. As a person of color, and especially as someone with strong Indigenous roots in Mexico, my mental health and mental health in general has always been about justice and healing for the people, for the purpose of gaining the energy and the strength to continue fighting institutional racism and creating intergenerational wealth and roots in the US. It's hard to carry on in school, quite frankly, when the first things you hear about are not African civilizations, Indigenous American civilizations, and the queer and trans historical figures and communities within these civilizations, but slavery, colonization, and the benevolence of people who have inflicted serious physical and psychological violence upon our ancestors. It makes you feel less than, and in my experience, it made me feel like I wasn't good enough to be in AP classes or to even go to college. If I hadn't had support from one history teacher and gotten access to therapy and been able to educate myself about where I'm from and why I should be proud of it, then I wouldn't be in college now. I'd be in a very, very different situation. That's why we got to take care of each other, show up for each other. And you can do that by showing love and compassion to people, to give people you normally would shut down the benefit of the doubt. But I won't say that love is the answer, of course, because love is not how you pass legislation or demand change. To propose love as a solution, I want to clarify, is almost offensive for Black and Indigenous people of color, because it insinuates that we need to be more resilient and smile more and be more optimistic about our situations, and the problems will go away. As if racism is based solely on the prejudices of individual oppressors and the bitterness of the oppressed, rather than the actual legal mechanisms that allow for systemic echo chamber type racism. As if we can resolve our trauma through a heart-to-heart. That's definitely not true. We need to acknowledge to each other that it's really hard to be optimistic right now, and that we're all in pain, and we need to listen to each other, especially people who are most impacted. that is the type of love we need to survive and carry on fighting. We got to tell each other that we need each other and appreciate each other's work.
I think Sophia's words are so important as we think about what can we do to advance change in our systems, in our communities, across our counties and across Pennsylvania. I think there are a lot of really wonderful youth voices and youth leaders out there that are doing this work. And I challenge you, if you haven't connected with a young person, particularly a BIPOC young person, in the past month, even just to do a check-in and say, hey, how are you doing? What's going on in your world? Do so. If you don't know any BIPOC youth, then maybe that's a personal, individual challenge for you to go and expand your network, expand your communities, so that you really can understand the other worldviews and perspectives of the communities that are present across Pennsylvania and across our country. For some people, that may be too courageous of a first step because it's, you're putting yourself out there. Some of us are introverts. So there's also really great resources in terms of books. There's a website called the Black Children's Books and Authors. They really are promoting campaigns around, there's a whole international campaign called Diverse Books, but this is particularly centering Black children's books and Black authors of children's books. And they put out a wonderful article about BIPOC Mental Health Awareness Month young adult fiction books that were created by Black authors. So these are books for the young adult audience, but can be read by all ages. I've actually read quite a few of them, and I love young adult fiction, even as an adult. And they tackle in the books instances of racial trauma and mental health for diverse communities. So these are just some of the cover shots of the books, but you can click on that link in the slides. It's clickable and it'll take you to the list of these 10 books. So that's another good step in terms of educating ourselves and really trying to expand our horizons, especially if you're a bit of an introvert and you're not at that stage yet where you're trying to outreach and engage with individuals or communities in this work. So a big part of this is allowing for transformations of our minds and hearts. We really have to understand that building out this work is also about creating new types of effective communication skills. A lot of us think we're great communicators, and we often aren't. There's a difference between hearing and listening, and then there's a difference also in terms of being active and being proactive in the work that we do. So respect and trust, if you think about how do you not only instill respect and trust in the work that you do, it's a part of making sure that you're a good listener, making sure that you are social and understand the context within which you're operating in, and that you can have power and you understand the power dynamics that are at play in relationships that you have with others, and that you are able to have empathy and concern for others. And I think that's really how we work on improving trust and respect in our relationships. And there was a study again done by Beach and Saha and Branyan in 2016 that really centered the voices of BIPOC youth and families. And they said, if we are going to be helped in the area, if our mental health and behavioral health care delivery is going to be enhanced, there's some key domains where folks could be working on. They could be working on being better listeners, paying attention to us rather than dismissing us, that we should be known as an individual to them. They should want to get to know us, and that they should remember us from our past interactions and conversations. That we shouldn't be treated rudely, that there's empowerment in being treated nicely, respectfully, politely. There's also kind of this myth or misunderstanding about BIPOC communities that they are constantly late, or that in this sense of trying to seek care, BIPOC folks and individuals will often do everything they can not to be late, to sort of disprove that myth of lateness, and yet their doctors will be late, Their providers will be late for meetings. Other people will not be respectful of their time. And so I think there's generally this need to work on timing, understanding how we value time, what our notions of time are, because time is also socially constructed and culturally imbued with different values. So working in that domain is something that we could be helping folks with. And then also trusting self-knowledge. So understanding that youth and families know about themselves. They know deeply their experience and what they're feeling, and to give them some trust and some respect in the knowledge that they're telling you about their experience and what's going on in their lives. So for us as providers, as practitioners, as folks working in systems, that means that we have to work in 3 core areas. We have to educate ourselves by either enhancing our networks, making sure that we are connected to communities, finding positive examples if we don't already know of them, changing our environment. It also means exposure, building awareness, building mindfulness of our staff and of our communities, and then changing our approach. So sometimes that's, creating organizational change. Maybe that's policy change. Maybe that's providing more trainings and opportunities for discussion and learning. One of the most important aspects of this is to make contact with positive, diverse colleagues, cultural brokers, community organizations, and exemplars that really can give you this experience of understanding other perspectives to contribute to the opportunity to decrease implicit bias and to kind of what we call this process of de-biasing in the work that we do. A big part of that too can be in our messaging, the environments that we create in our buildings, in our staff spaces. What are we saying to folks? The example here is something as simple as having a safe zone sticker or a safe zone poster can be really affirming and even micro-affirming as opposed to microaggressions towards communities to say, particularly for the LGBTQ community, this is a welcome space, this is a safe space, we are your ally. And if you're not familiar with the Safe Zone project or the Safe Zone posters and stickers, just Google Safe Zone and more of those resources and the whole Safe Zone project and toolkit will come up. And it's something that you can take an actionable step towards including or implementing in your local environment. So as we kind of close out and move into the last bit of questions and answers or discussion, I just wanted to make you aware of, as I mentioned at the top of the session, Mental Health America has so many resources out for BIPOC Mental Health Month in celebration of July. But they also are going to be hosting a free conference. Their annual conference has gone virtual as we all pivot and adjust to COVID-19 and the way in which it's shaping our lives. And in particularly, they've even made the theme of this year's conference COVID-19, mental health, and the need for equity. So they're really going to be doing a lot of the DG diversity, equity, justice, inclusion work across that conference, September 3rd and 4th, and it's free. So that link there is provided if you'd like to register for that conference in the slides, and I'll post the slides again for folks. All of our trainings, as I mentioned earlier, are available on our PA Care Partnership website under the Cultural Linguistic Webinar Series tab. You're welcome to rewatch some of our sessions and download slides from previous sessions there. So I will stop talking, and anyone that would like to unmute themselves, if you just want to raise your hand, you kind of go to your participants tab and you hover over your name, and there should be a bar where you can raise your hand, and then we will ask you to unmute yourself. If for some reason you don't see the hand item readily available, there should be ellipses when you click that participants button, and the hand button is also there if you need it. So yeah, this is a really open discussion. If there's any questions about what we presented so far in the PowerPoint, or just general questions you have about systems of care and CLC, we're happy to answer them. Yeah, we had a question to put the registration in the chat, so I will do that. I'll just stop sharing for a moment and then copy that over. Try and restart my video as well. And you can also type your questions into the chat box if you'd like. We had someone ask the website again. Okay, that's probably for the PA Care Partnership. I'll do that. So we've got a PA Care Partnership request. So I'll do that one first. So this is where next week you can currently download all of our sessions that have been posted to date there, along with the slides. So past sessions that you haven't participated or weren't able to participate in, or maybe you did and you want to go back and take a look. And then we also had a request for the slides one more time. So I'm going to post those now. Those are also going into the chat box. And that's also where you can find all of these links as well. You just download the slides and then the links are they're hyperlinks. You can directly click on them or copy them and paste them into your browser. This is also the BIPOC Mental Health America Toolkit for Mental Health Month. I'm going to load that into the chat box. And then I will also post the COVID-19 Mental Health Equity Conference link as requested. And that again is free. Anyone else with questions? Anything you'd like to ask or chat about? We've got a few folks in. I'm also going to, yeah, you're now at a stage where I've just released the permissions, so you can unmute yourself if you'd like. You don't have to raise a hand. You can just
Hello.
say hey.
My name
Hi.
is Hi. My name is Tasha. I'm from Philly. I have a quick question. Is the suicide rate increasing since everything's going on?
That's a great question. I don't have the data in front of me, but I will say that on the I've attended other sessions and have seen a few articles that have stated there's a correlation of an increased suicide rate. I will say, and I don't know though, I don't know exactly if that's suicidal attempts or, so I would caution you to maybe look that up and probably regionally specific. There's a great resource. I'll actually type that in right now. I'll just pull it up. It's called US Data, ISO, and they have created a really wonderful COVID-19 health data set that's sort of linking CDC data and other data. And so I would say if you Google US Data ISO, click on that and then it'll take you to their website and you'll be able to see some of this. And I think they also have the data about suicides. I will say that Mental Health America did mention that they didn't note in terms of an increase of suicide rates, maybe in terms of suicidal attempts. They did note that they've seen, I think, a 20,000 per month increase in their hotline, and so people reaching out to them for assistance. So I think that, and I've heard that with other organizations as well, that there are more people that are calling the hotlines for a variety of mental and behavioral health concerns.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? If there's any experiences that you've had relative to racial trauma or things that you'd like to raise awareness for in terms of Minority Mental Health Awareness Month or BIPOC Month, we're happy to share announcements and share opportunities for other folks.
Hello, my name is Myra. I would like to say that I think it would be nice if the younger people would take a little bit of time for our elderly relatives and see if there's anything that we could do to help them during this time of crisis.
Yeah, I think that that's so important. Thank you for sharing that with us. There is really this need for us to have this intergenerational approach and connection in the work that we do. I think there's also a lot that we can learn in terms of how we make advancements to address current racial and social injustices in our society based on the experiences of older generations that are still with us. There's so much that we can learn from folks who have been living with these injustices for decades, if not longer. And so I think that that's really important. And I think, you know, just on a basic human level, you're recognizing that we need to be reaching out to more folks. Whether you're a part of a systems of care or you're an individual family or youth partner calling in, we all can be doing more to sort of have more of those human-to-human connections or check-ins, even if they have to be in some virtual or tele capacity given our priority in making sure that people are healthy and safe, and that we sort of respect physical distancing guidelines with COVID-19. Well, I'm going to just, and if folks have additional questions or comments, feel free to, unmute yourself or type into the chat box. I'm just going to share my screen to provide additional information as we close out today's session for what we have remaining in our celebration of BIPOC Mental Health Month and National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. So with that, we have a Trauma 107 training with Lakeside Institute that will be occurring next week. Unfortunately, I hope that for many of you, you were able to register for this training because it is now full. But we just want you to be aware for that, that we are offering this training, and that maybe if you're from a county that wants to try and partner with Lakeside, or an organization or provider that wants to partner with Lakeside, this is a standing training that they have, Trauma 107. This is the first year that it's being offered virtually because we're all pivoting because of COVID-19. But we're really excited because it, in a lot of ways allows us to give more access to people to these trainings. And so this first one, again, it's about the intersections of CLC, cultural competence, and trauma. And it is going to be from 12 to 4 next Thursday. So if you're someone that's already registered, you should be getting your registration links and all of that from Lakeside. And we look forward to hosting you next week. You probably won't hear too much from me aside from maybe an introduction on that session. I, like everyone else, will be a trainee. And so I'm excited for that. But again, if you're coming from a county or a provider that wants to partner with Lakeside, you could partner with them to offer this training individually. And we're hopeful that we'll be able to offer it to more folks again in the future.
Hi, this is Tasha again. Can you be waitlisted for that training? Because as soon as my job told me about it, it was full. So is there a wait list?
That, you know what, Tasha, if you want to email me, I'm going to go to the next slide, which is has my email on it, but I'll also type it into the chat box right now. I can add you to a wait list. And that can go for anyone on today's session. We are full, but I can add you to a wait list if you'd like to be added. And I think that's just a courtesy that we can extend to you for being folks that have already participated on our webinars. Wonderful. So we just always end our sessions with telling folks cultural and linguistic competency are a life's journey, not a destination, so safe travels. As always, if you have any questions about today's webinar, or you need any additional technical assistance or have comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to me at leonardkt@upmc.edu, and I'm happy to offer additional assistance. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us on this session today. That concludes the session, and we will definitely be reaching out to you once we have our webinar with the Black Urban Gardeners rescheduled, probably sometime in September. Thanks again to everyone.
Hey, thank you, Kelsey. Great job.